Hello, and hello specifically to Professor Krebs. Welcome to Disability Diatribe. For my Communication and Disability Studies course, Media Disability and Futurity, I have to create a futurity project that demonstrates a vision of CRIP futurity. If you don't know what CRIP futurity is or have never heard of disability studies, don't worry, we'll get to that soon enough. If all goes well, this podcast will make some of the concepts I've learned in my disability studies class more accessible for you and others. The goal of this podcast is to give everyone, especially Fordham University students, teachers, and young adults, more information about the problems transgender people face and how to help where you can. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on how the lens of disability studies, the idea of CRIP futurity, changes how we think about transgender identities and transgender bodies. The title of this podcast, Disability Diatribe, and the format is inspired by one of my favorite YouTube channels, Overly Sarcastic Productions. Their dialogic detail diatribe series is always fun to listen to, and I think an ideal format for explaining dense concepts and generating productive discussion. I wanted to make this video essay with one of my friends, but unfortunately they dropped out at the last minute, so I will be playing the role of both the questioner and the answerer. Disclaimer, this episode will involve discussion of suicide and self-harm. If you are in danger of harming yourself or others, please talk to somebody. There are non-carceral resources linked alongside this episode. Thank you to Professor Krebs for those links. These hotlines and other resources will do everything they can do to help you make it through a crisis. They will not call the police or try to involuntarily hospitalize you. This video is not a crisis resource, and I cannot promise it will help you through an immediate crisis if you are experiencing one. Reflecting on the suicide of a close friend at the end of chapter 4 of his book, Brilliant Imperfections, disability studies scholar Eli Clare asked, "Friend, what would have made your life possible with all its aches and sorrows?" In a similar vein, this episode seeks to ask what makes life possible for transgender people, despite the ways in which we suffer. What unacknowledged joys or brilliant imperfections does being transgender bring? All that being said, let's jump in. First of all, let's clear some things up. In recent years, transgender people, including their identities, the labels and language they use, and their gender behaviors, have experienced unprecedented visibility in culture and politics. This attention has had both positives and negatives. On one hand, more transgender and gender nonconforming people have the opportunity to publicly identify with their preferred gender. Transgender people are more accepted now than in the past when they choose to express themselves in a way that does not align with the expectations associated with their assigned gender at birth. Gender-affirming care is more readily available, and medical advancements have increased the variety, quality, and safety of procedures available to transgender people. Yay! On the other hand, increased visibility has led to reactionary hostility against and the scapegoating of transgender people. According to CBS News, murders of trans people have nearly doubled between 2017 and 2021, and as of 2019, transgender people are 2.5 times more likely to experience violence than cisgender people. According to UCLA's Williams Institute, 40% of transgender adults have attempted suicide. Some people, including our current president, go so far as to argue that allowing transgender people, particularly transgender women, to identify as and be treated according to their self-identified gender is an inherent threat to women in American society at large. This is a quote from Donald Trump's Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government executive order. He says, efforts to eradicate the biological reality of sex fundamentally attack women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, and well-being. The erasure of sex in language and policy has a corrosive impact not just on women, but on the validity of the entire American system. These people suggest that transgender people are inherently dangerous because they distort the biological reality of sex. Supposedly, this attack on the biological reality of sex is dangerous because transgender people seek to prey on women, or because the act of not conforming to gender and sexual norms constitutes an attack on the identities of all cis men and women, or the vague validity of the entire American system. Boo. So what does it mean to be transgender? Why do people think that transgender people are dangerous? What do transgender people need to live happy, healthy lives? First, just to start off, because I know this is a dense topic and one that a lot of people are unfamiliar with, I want to define some terms. First, transgender describes someone who does not identify with their assigned gender at birth. For instance, transgender women were assigned male at birth and later chose to identify as a woman. Transgender men were assigned female at birth and later chose to identify as a man. Non-binary and gender non-conforming people do not identify as a man or a woman regardless of their assigned gender at birth. I personally identify as queer and non-binary, meaning I don't identify as cisgender or heterosexual. I don't confine my attraction or my experience of gender to either the norms ascribed to men or women. Cisgender, on the other hand, is the opposite of transgender, describing people who do identify with their assigned gender at birth. Most people are cisgender. Gender ideology is a term that gets thrown around a lot. It doesn't have a specific definition, but I wanted to take a stab at it to try to describe how it's used. Gender ideology could be ideologies that determine who should express certain gendered behaviors, possess certain gendered traits, or have access to certain gendered spaces and opportunities. Gender ideology is not the ideology of trans people. Everyone has a gender ideology. It's the ideology that structures what you think about gender. For example, Donald Trump's ideology of gender says that access to gendered behaviors, traits, spaces, and opportunities should correspond to one's biologically determined assigned gender at birth. On the other hand, a more liberal ideology of gender would say that access to gendered behaviors, traits, spaces, and opportunities should correspond to one's self-identified gender. This more liberal ideology challenges the idea that there is a biological reality of sex, suggesting that no biological facts determine who can present as a woman or who can use the women's bathroom. Next, gender dysphoria. This is the distress that transgender people experience when their assigned gender or gendered features do not align with their self-identified gender. Cisgender people can experience gender dysphoria as well. For instance, a cisgender man may feel distressed because he is not as tough or muscular as others expect a man to be. So it's not something that's just limited to trans people, but it is typically portrayed as a symptom of being transgender. Gender-affirming care or medical transitioning are treatments that alter someone's body to align it with their self-identified gender. It's included but not limited to hormone replacement therapy, breast reduction or enlargement, hair removal or transplants, and bottom surgery, which is vaginoplasty or phalloplasty, where you turn a penis into a vagina or a clitoris into a penis. So one of my big questions, or one of the big claims I'm making here, is answering, are transgender people disabled? And I think in a lot of ways that they are, that being trans constitutes a disability. But there are a couple models of disability. So let's go over some of the basic terminology of disability studies that'll help us better explore this question of whether transgender people could be considered disabled. There are a couple of models of disability. Generally, disabled people with body minds that do not conform to what is considered normal in terms of their body or mind, in terms of its appearance or ability. Generally, that's what is considered disabled, but there are a couple different models, like I said. Body minds, which is a term I will be using a lot, refers to the body and mind as a whole, challenging the idea that the mind is separate from or should be prioritized over the body, or rules over the body. And under this first cursory definition of disability, transgender people then are disabled because their bodies and minds do not conform to what is considered normal for their self-identified gender. Transgender people are denied the opportunity to go into a women's bathroom, which is an ability that cisgender people have, or cisgender women have, and transgender women do not. And I would argue that constitutes a disability. But let's get a little bit more in depth. How is disability conceptualized, and what does that mean for transgender people? The two major models I'm going to be focusing on of disability are the medical and social models. The medical model views disability as biological. It's an error or deformity in someone's body or mind. This model prioritizes finding a cure for disabilities, placing more value on potential future medical technologies, with the aim of eradicating disability. Disabled people need medical research, or it says disabled people need medical research and medical intervention. Some of the downside to disability is that it locates disability within, or this model, is that it locates disability within the bodies and minds of disabled people by pathologizing them. Disabled people who cannot be cured are framed as not trying hard enough, or living inherently undesirable lives, and it assumes all bodies and minds should conform to a medically defined standard of normality. Under this model, transgender people are disabled because their bodies and minds do not conform to the gender binary. It's a biological error that makes their lives harder. In the past, transgender identities have been classified as sexual deviations. The desire to behave and identify out of the norms of one's assigned gender at birth were classified as a mental illness that needed to be corrected or separated from the rest of society. In the DSM-5, gender identity disorder has been reclassified as gender dysphoria, which pathologizes the distress transgender people experience rather than pathologizing the identities themselves. What transgender people need is medical intervention to alter their appearance or self-perception to what they would like it to be. So that's how the medical model conceives of disabled people and transgender people. The social model of disability, on the other hand, views disability as a social condition created by an inaccessible society. Impairments, which is a term that refers to the lack of ability itself as opposed to these like social conditions that can disable people or restrict what people have access to. Impairments are not the problem. Rather, suffering is caused by an ableist society discriminating against disabled people on the basis of their bodily or behavioral differences. The root of the disability rights movement and the argument behind many of the advances made in civil rights protections for disabled people comes from this model. It prioritizes legal and social reforms to give disabled people the same opportunities as able-bodied people. Some of the downsides are that it doesn't acknowledge disabled people who need medical intervention to survive or choose it for other reasons, and it doesn't leave room for disabled people who have suffering that can't be eliminated through social justice. Chronically ill people, for instance, and a lot of other conditions that can't be just remedied through social justice, and disabled people who have those conditions do seek medical care, and this model doesn't leave a lot of room for those people. Because it resists so strongly the idea that disabled people have something wrong with them or wrong with their bodies. It just doesn't acknowledge that disabled people may want or need things not encompassed by the opportunities an able-bodied society offers to able-bodied people. Like maybe disabled people want stuff that's more than what an able-bodied society offers or is different from what an able-bodied society offers, rather than just being on par with whatever able-bodied people have. Under this model, transgender people are disabled because society does not recognize them as their assigned gender at birth. It argues that they need social reforms to give transgender men and women access to the same stuff as cisgender men and women. For example, letting transgender women have access to women's public bathrooms or letting transgender women change their legally recognized gender on their driver's license, birth certificate, or marriage license would both be examples of reforms under the social model. Most people's conception of disability falls somewhere between the social and the medical models, or has elements of both. Many people believe that disability should face less social discrimination and inequality, and also believe that they need medical solutions for their impairments. These models are important because they determine how disabled people are conceptualized and treated in society. A central tension between these two models is exemplified in their relationship to the ideology of cure. The ideology of cure is a approach to medical intervention in disability that suggests that the impairments disabled people have need to be cured through medical technology. If no cure exists, all resources should go towards inventing one. When cures cannot remedy the existing bodies of disabled people, they often turn to preventing disabled people from reproducing or new disabled children from being born. The transgender rights movement struggles with this same tension. On one hand, gender-affirming care has rapidly advanced towards the goal of curing the discrepancy between one's appearance and self-perception and their self-identified gender. Many transgender people have benefited from medically transitioning and from gender-affirming care. On the other hand, gender-affirming care can perpetuate the idea that transgender people have to conform to some specific image of their body-mind to be treated and perceived as their self-identified gender. So these are some issues, and there is a central tension between these two models. Obviously, the problems that transgender people face are complex, and it's not as simple as embracing or rejecting this ideology of cure. As a non-binary person, I'm facing this issue right now. I don't want to be perceived as a man, but I also don't want to be perceived as a woman. I'm hesitant to alter my appearance because of my fear of discrimination, my fear that I will never find a body that feels good, my fear of giving into the social pressures that tell me my body needs to change to conform to my self-identified gender. And here I'm going to bring in Eli Clare, which is one of the people we read in class, to help kind of like piece out this distinction in the ideology of cure and what kind of relationship disabled and transgender people can have to it. Eli Clare is an American writer, activist, educator, speaker, and genderqueer trans man who focuses on queer, transgender, and disability issues in his writing. In his book, Brilliant Imperfections, Clare advocates for the celebration of disabled body minds and grapples with the ways in which ideology of cure both helps and hurts disabled people. Let's see what he has to say. In Chapter 4, Nuances of Cure, Clare recognizes the ideology of cure as both a restorative force, but also a powerful normalizing force. For example, the Sierra Club put out a series of ads in an ad campaign titled Beyond Coal. These ads argue we need to stop burning coal by describing the ways in which mercury pollution from coal power plants damages the body minds of women and fetuses. Clare says, by bluntly leveraging ableism, the ads conflate justice with the eradication of disability. And this is kind of problematic because it's like we don't want to eradicate disabled people, and it leaves out the experiences of these people who are disabled that are really valuable, and like the lives that they live that despite these impairments that they suffer. Clare says further, the desire for cure, for the restoration of health, is connected to loss and yearning. The ideology of cure anchors itself in the idea that there is a natural or normal state that body minds must conform to. But bodies and minds are always in motion and incredibly fragile. Clare questions how this standard of naturality or normality gets created, and who makes that decision. Who decides what state the ideology of cure is moving towards? Oftentimes it's not disabled people. The ideology of cure can be a force for restoration as it motivates people to invest heavily in a vision of the future without disability. However, this blunt leveraging of ableism that encourages fear of disability fails to capture the ways in which disabled people make the most of their imperfect lives and imperfect bodies. Clare says, cure is such a compelling response to body-mind loss precisely because it promises our imagined time travel. But this promise can also devalue our present-day selves. It can lead us to dismiss the lessons we've learned, knowledge gained, and scars acquired. This message that resists the ideology of cure, or at least doesn't fully embrace it, is powerful for transgender people. The expected reaction to being transgender is gender dysphoria, and the expected reaction to gender dysphoria is seeking medical intervention. These expectations heavily reflect the ideology of cure, suggesting the ideal future is one where no one is born transgender. The access to cures is often restricted on the basis of the ideology of cure and its attitude towards one's body-mind. When doctors are prescribing gender-affirming care, they are looking for a specific story, often a sob story, that transgender people have to conform to, or at least pretend to conform to get the medical care they seek. What does it mean for transgender people who don't want that, or who don't feel that way about their bodies? What alternatives exist? Clare cites the essayist Nancy Mears and the disabled feminist thinker Susan Wendell to imagine what disability justice looks like in the space between social justice and medical intervention. Nancy Mears, reflecting on having multiple sclerosis, emphasizes how, despite drawing lines in the sand, boundaries of suffering beyond which one is certain life will no longer be worth living, I go on being, now more than ever, the woman I thought I could never bear to be. Susan Wendell says, when she advocates for chronically ill disabled people, some unhealthy disabled people experience physical or psychological burdens that no amount of social justice can eliminate. Therefore, some very much want to have their bodies cured, not as a substitute for curing ableism, but in addition to it. Clare emphasizes the importance of bearing witness to the suffering rather than fleeing from it, as the ideology of cure encourages us to do. Everyone has these things that they think life would not be worth living without, like these abilities that society grants them, or these parts of their body or parts of their mind that they think are essential to who they are and to enjoying life in general, to living a good life. But that erases the fact that there are people who live with disabilities, and there are people like myself who live pre-transition as transgender people. I don't know what kind of transition I want to pursue, or if I do want to pursue a transition. But Claire's emphasis on bearing witness really helps me be more accepting of the person I am right now. He says, "Instead, I carry these losses with me. I'm slowly learning the importance of bearing witness, a quiet daily recognition, so different from the desire to repair. I let these losses sit uncomfortably in my heart. When a body mind is damaged, imperfect, or incomplete, as I would argue all body minds are, we often treat this as a fate worse than death, ignoring the ways in which disabled people and transgender people make community and joy out of their struggles. The desire to eradicate disabled body minds also locates the problem within the body minds of disabled people, ignoring the harm done by ableism. Transgender people in particular attempt suicide or are murdered or otherwise suffer violence in many ways that get pinned on their mental health, which tacitly justifies violence against them and fails to acknowledge the social causes. Living as a pre-transition transgender person can often feel like a death sentence. It's hard to imagine gender-affirming care that doesn't also erase some essential part of me. In Clare, I find an impulse towards gender-affirming care, not out of a desire for community, a desire for conformity, but out of a desire to emphasize and express the imperfection of my body, going from what Clare calls eradication to almost pride. In Chapter 6, Clare elaborates more on how cure works. He says, "It took me weeks to recognize the gap between my desire for less pain and the doctor's desire for cure. The desire for cure is not one primarily focused on reducing the suffering of disabled people, but rather getting body minds to conform to the medically defined normal state. Doctors who do surgeries on newborns to make their genitalia conform to the standard of a penis or vagina are a prime example of this. Medical interventions have helped a lot of disabled people, transgender people included. But, as Clare points out, at the same time, we mustn't ignore the ways in which research's future-focused commitment has served to devalue people in the present. The ideology of cure focuses on funneling resources towards imaginary cures that will eliminate disability once and for all. Placing this value in the future ignores the ways in which disabled people need those resources to live better and more comfortable lives today, while being still disabled. How can I possibly not want a cure?" Clare says. "I would lose so much if that imaginary cure pill actually existed. Its absence lets me be unequivocal. It opens the door to brilliant imperfection." Clare goes on to discuss how the deaf community has reacted to cochlear implants as an example of grappling with this kind of cure and how it works through our lives. Cochlear implants carry risks that are often downplayed and prioritize a vision of audible communication that erases the language and culture of the deaf community. Many deaf people wish to and have worked to stop this onslaught of technology. One deaf mother who has a child with cochlear implant sums up many of these shifts. She says, "We can't stop cochlear implants from happening. People think we can stop it completely. It's not possible. It won't happen. Let's put it aside. We should shift our focus more on how to keep ASL alive." I think the key is to make everyone understand that the child with a cochlear implant is still deaf. These children will miss out in a spoken language environment. ASL still provides full access to a language. In the same way, gender-affirming care will almost always be the expected reaction to gender dysphoria. It is important to recognize that no amount of gender-affirming care can erase one's identity as transgender. The need for gender-affirming care comes alongside the need to preserve transgender communities and have better sex education, both of which will help people discover how to accept and embrace the natural differences that exist in human sexual characteristics and along the gender spectrum. As important as gender-affirming care is, especially when it comes to resisting a government that wants to ban it and erase transgender people altogether, it is an incomplete remedy to our suffering and motivated by an ideology that devalues the bodies transgender people are born into. Clare says, "Cure technology keeps evolving, but the ideology behind it stays the same, valuing some body minds and devaluing others. This dynamic often intensifies the forces placed upon people deemed trouble." For example, in the case of the drug ethofluorethine, Cure's life-saving purpose becomes trumped by its manipulating and life-prioritizing purposes, both of which seamlessly slide into a profit-making purpose. Ethafluorethine started as a drug to cure sleeping sickness in Africa, and it was incredibly successful. It worked incredibly well. But because of the lack of a market in Africa, that the people who were benefiting from this drug could not pay for it in a way that was profitable for the company making it, it was discontinued and only produced again in response to being repurposed as a facial hair remover for women in Western wealthy countries. Access to the drug in Africa was only restored after public pressure from Doctors Without Borders. In the same way, American transgender people can only get health care they want or need through the profit-maximizing medical industrial complex. Starbucks, for example, offers expanded benefits for transgender people and has been a pathway to medical transitioning for many people I personally know. At the same time, they engage in illegal union busting. Gender-affirming care becomes a carrot dangled over trans people's heads to get them to accept an unequal power arrangement with their employer. In Chapter 8, Clare goes on to the idea of moving through cure and this concept of choosing or unchoosing disability. He says that in modern society, especially American society, we go to great lengths to unchoose disability. Disability and death are paired together, the first considered a more powerful argument against unsafe driving than the second, Clare says. There are lots of ways in which we unchoose disability like this, or encourage people to unchoose disability. There's genetic testing and disability-selective abortions. Sperm clinics screen for deafness, alcoholism, cystic fibrosis, depression, schizophrenia, all kinds of conditions. Clare emphasizes that we want to control how and when and if disability and death appear in our lives. And society furthermore reacts very negatively to people who do choose disability. Deaf parents who request a deaf adoptive child are questioned. Parents who forgo genetic testing or disability-selective abortion are seen as foolish or malicious. Trans-abled people are lampooned for wanting bodily impairments. The act of choosing disability in the white Western world is never neutral, simply one choice among many, but pathologized, shamed, sensationalized. In contrast, unchoosing disability is celebrated and framed as a collective imperative. Clare says, even under ideologies that support gender-affirming care, transgender people are expected to conform to specific ideas about what a man or woman should look like, and they're blamed for the discrimination they face when they do not conform or they do not pursue medical treatments. Ableist societies focus on enforcing these monocultures, both within human and non-human populations. Clare says this desire for eradication runs deep. It's a pattern that reaches across space and time. Unchoosing of disability fits into this pattern, one force among many, threatening to create a human monoculture. Claiming disability is something that Clare offers as an alternative to this. Beyond the binary of choosing or unchoosing lies, the many ways we claim disability and chronic illness. We make peace, we accept. We celebrate, we let go. We find pride, we live with ambiguity. We face mortality, we reject pity and overcoming. We build community and grow accustomed to isolation. We seek interdependence. We turn away from expectations of hyperproductivity. We insist on what we know about our own body minds, and we learn to balance loss and pride. We deal with frustration and pain. I'm loath to define claiming. Sometimes it lives near an act of choosing of disability. Other times it shares much in common with unchoosing. Often it is laced with contradiction. Celebrating disability where others revile it is a powerful claiming. Choosing interdependence and imperfection over the fiction of a completely autonomous, supposedly normal person is also a powerful claiming. Part of claiming disability is choosing this imperfect work in progress called interdependence, Clare says. So how do trans people suffer from the unchoosing of disability? Well, assigned gender at birth is one of the primary ways, just the whole existence of that concept. During this time and place in history, doctors have the authority to name and classify sex and gender just as they do a disability, Clare says. Most of these surgeries are not medically necessary, but rather cosmetic, blatantly enforcing what is normal and cutting away what is declared abnormal, Clare says, referring to the surgeries on infants that alter their genitalia. My body-mind politics told me that plastic surgery, particularly for cosmetic reasons, was bad, a tool of the patriarchy, enforcing sexist and racist standards of beauty, encouraging body-mind mutilation and hatred, Clare says. He provides the example of cis women getting cosmetic surgery to please their husbands, or societal expectations of what they should look like. Clare emphasizes that the medical industrial complex makes so much money off of transgender people and their desire to change their bodies, and says that my politics argued I needed to change the world and claim my body-mind as it was. Clare goes on to describe his own journey of pursuing gender-affirming care. In order to do so in 2002, Clare needed a diagnosis of gender identity disorder, and it was unique among diagnoses because it's one that transgender people actively seek out as a pathway to getting the healthcare they desire. Where cisgender men or women can get breast enlargements or reductions, testosterone or estrogen prescriptions, hair removal or implantation, transgender people have to prove they are not harming themselves to receive the same treatments. This process of getting this diagnosis encourages one to think of transgender identities through a pathological lens, treating the desire to change one's gender features as a disorder. Clare started their search not because they needed a diagnosis or because they wanted to reshape their gendered and sexual body as a disorder. Instead, they just didn't want to have boobs anymore, which I think is so fair. They just wanted chest reconstruction surgery. They wanted to look differently. But this surgeon, their surgeon wanted a letter from a therapist confirming that they had GID and was a good candidate for surgery. Gender identity disorder has gone through a number of different iterations in the DSM-5. It started out as a sexual deviation, but then it was placed under paraphilias and transvestism, also transsexualism in the DSM-3 in 1980, when other queer identities like lesbian, gay, and bisexual identities were being removed from the DSM-3. And then the DSM-4 in 1994 combined them into gender identity disorder. The medical industrial complex, as shown by this, is a maze of rules and regulations that distribute care on the arbitrary basis of what medical treatments are considered normal to desire and pathologizes trans people, as we've seen, like they're treated as sexual deviations. The process encourages transgender people to question themselves, to fit themselves into a specific vision that identifies their body minds as wrong or deviant and in need of correction. At the end of our 5 sessions, Clare says, I received the letter and diagnosis I needed. I was able to navigate the whole process with my sense of self intact because I had a community network. I was familiar with the routine of therapy, and I knew just how honest to be. The medical industrial complex makes transgender people jump through hoops or pretend to be something that they're not in order to get the care that they need. The DSM-5 has slightly improved on gender identity disorder. It has become gender dysphoria. This move didn't happen on its own. Trans activists put significant pressure on the working groups that created it. But this kind of switch just emphasizes, Clare says, how made up these diagnoses are. There's nothing inevitable, natural, or inherent about them. They reflect current white, Western cultural and scientific beliefs and practices. And gender dysphoria this concept is a little bit better because it focuses on the distress rather than the identity. But Clare urges us to reach farther. He says, I want to imagine the dismantling of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Sorry if I didn't clarify that earlier. That's the handbook that professional psychiatrists and psychotherapists use to diagnose psychiatric and psychological conditions. But yeah, I want to imagine the dismantling of the DSM itself, discarding the concept of disorder and defect, developing other means of accessing medical technology beyond white Western diagnosis. Yes, I am suggesting a rebellion. So what does it mean to claim this disability within transgender identities? What is that rebellion? Where do we go from here? Claiming disability is vulnerable and often involves heavy risk, especially for women, trans people, people of color, and other minorities that already have their standing in society questioned, often on the basis of their ability or disability. Addressing his friend and scholarly peer Gloria Nzaldua, Clare says, there are many reasons why people don't identify as disabled. Might you have adopted the word if you had known some disabled women of color, if the disability rights movement had been less white? Clare says, this time, through cracks and across chasms, we might claim disability together as strength and vulnerability, independence and hard work, risk and fear. So, solidarity among disability, as it shows up in the lives of trans people, women, people of color, and others, only works when we attend to the ways in which marginalized communities recognize and accept the presence of disabled people. I believe understanding my transgender identity as a disability has helped me better see the importance of embracing and attending to disability in queer and trans communities. Furthermore, in Missing What You Never Had, Autistic and Queer, Kit Mead, a disability studies scholar, reflects on the ways in which stereotypes around queer and trans people, as well as the spaces that are available to them, have often excluded autistic and other disabled people. They ask, what does it mean to not be able to find a community you feel you should be part of? They wrestle with the feeling like they have failed at being queer and not being able to exist in the same loud spaces as other able-bodied queer people. Kit Mead says, so here's what it means to be autistic and queer, also not able to find a queer community. 1, people don't believe you're actually a gender, feeling like you don't have a gender, and sexually queer and not straight as hell because you're autistic. 2, you feel like you're missing an integral part of being queer by not having a queer community around you. 3, you feel like an invisible queer person. Autistic queer people are often infantilized or desexualized. Their right to self-definition is taken away when their queerness is reduced to a symptom of their autism, and they are thought as incapable of expressing a fully developed sexuality. Applied behavioral analysis, a controversial treatment for autistic people, focuses on eliminating certain autistic behaviors and has its roots in conversion therapy. This idea that queer autistic people need to behave in a particular way, a way that is often treated as mutually exclusive with queerness, contributes to their erasure. Kit Mead asks the question, how can you miss something you've never had? And answers it, saying, I missed from the moment I signed up and could not participate, watching from the sidelines like an injured athlete. And I miss knowing what could have been rather than what was, feeling like I'm missing an integral part of me being queer by not being in queer spaces. Most images of queer people revolve around able-bodied minds, conventionally attractive, and able to take part in pride parades, dancing to loud music at gay clubs, or reading the social cues that queer people use to communicate within their communities. Kit Mead encourages us to think about how we construct our communities, whether that's queer communities or trans communities or communities of color, and how that can potentially exclude disabled people. So what now? The gender binary and heteronormativity conjure up a very specific list of behaviors, traits, spaces, and opportunities that are only accessible to people on the basis of being either a man or a woman. Male behaviors, traits, spaces, and opportunities are mutually exclusive with female ones. These expectations are built into everything. For example, airport body scanners are inadvertently penis detection machines. Because they detect objects on a person's body, they have to be programmed to ignore breasts and penises. Because these machines assume people are either men or women, they have 2 modes. A mode for men, programmed to ignore penises, and a mode for women, programmed to ignore breasts. This creates problems for trans women who have not undergone bottom surgery, for example, and subsequently have their penises identified as foreign objects, forcing them to undergo further inspection and potential harassment by TSA employees. Another example, I have a very distinct memory of drawing an eye in middle school and adding a swoop to the end, as if it had eyeliner on. A friend remarked that it was a girl's eye. I had drawn a girl's eye. I asked why, and he said the swoop made it a girl's eye. I didn't think it was a girl's eye, I just thought it was pretty, but from that day forward, it's been hard to see it any other way. Even today, when society makes more allowances for transgender people are forced to fit in specific stereotypes or standards that tell them how to experience their own gender and what kind of care they need. The focus on gender-affirming care reflects the ideology of care. It encourages transgender people to pathologize their bodies and conform to whatever society tells them gender should look like. At the same time, gender-affirming care does really help some people, and it is something I will probably pursue in the future in some form. So what does claiming disability look like for transgender people? First of all, I am in full support of Clare's rebellion. Medical technologies that allow for the modification of one's body should be accessible outside the maze of the medical industrial complex that pathologizes transgender bodies, forces transgender people to do the same to themselves to gain access to healthcare, and allocates care on the basis of profit. People need to be more aware of the ways in which being transgender is disabling, and the social forces that restrict access to expression of one's self-identified gender. I do not experiment with my appearance as much as I would like because I am so afraid of being judged. We need intersectional communities that recognize the way queerness, transness, blackness, and other marginalized identities intersect with disability. The discrimination marginalized groups face often shows up as ableism, emphasizing the importance of including disabled people in liberatory movements. Failing to challenge ableism in our own communities only causes harm. Transphobia is fundamentally an issue surrounding how certain gendered traits, behaviors, spaces, and opportunities are only afforded to cisgender men and women. This parallels how certain behaviors, traits, spaces, and opportunities are only afforded to able-bodied people. Fighting both types of discrimination must happen in tandem. We need to celebrate transgender minds and bodies, the ways in which our bodies are imperfect and yet do not need to be altered. If I could go back and change the body I was born into, I would not. I have no idea what kind of person I would be if I would still be myself if I was not born transgender. I wish I had not been assigned male at birth. I wish I was not raised a man. That is different, however, from wishing I was born in a different body. I believe this body can be beautiful and feminine in the ways I desire when it is celebrated rather than pathologized. I love this body, even when I don't like it. If I was not transgender, I would miss out on so many connections, friendships, relationships, and shared experiences that matter so much to me and who I am. Being transgender is not easy, especially in today's political climate, but I would not be the same person if I was not actively choosing to express my self-identified gender in opposition to my assigned gender at birth. So, to finish this off, I want to talk about the principles of disability justice and some access suggestions from Sins Invalid. Sins Invalid is a disability justice organization, and they put together this really helpful lists. And so I want to point out a few of the things that they said that I think really exemplify the message I'm trying to convey. 3 principles of disability justice I think are incredibly important to transgender people and the intersection between transgender identities and disability are intersectionality. In short, the problems transgender people and disabled people face are inexorably linked. Any movement that ignores the ableism in transphobia and disabled trans people weakens itself. 2, recognizing wholeness. Transgender people don't need to be fixed, medically or otherwise. We seek to alleviate our own suffering and build community on our shared experiences. We are whole people before and after transitioning. Transness is a part of us that cannot be erased. And finally, 3, interdependence. Gender is one of those strange things that we all have access to in one form or another, but only through each other. Building communities that recognize people's self-identified gender and give them the tools to express it is critical. No one can do this alone. And finally, 3 accessibility suggestions pulled from Sins Invalid's list of accessibility suggestions. First, have disabled and trans people on the organizing team. There are things that able-bodied transgender people and disabled cisgender people will miss. There's also a wide range of transgender identities and wide range in ways those identities overlap with disabled identities. Consider who you are trying to serve and whether they are being accurately represented. Second, reflect on your own access needs. Most transgender people would not consider themselves disabled in the way I would suggest we are. Expression of one's self-identified gender and sexuality is an ability granted to some people and not others. Cisgender people and transgender people alike could benefit from considering how society grants them access to gender. And finally, transparency and access check-ins. Oftentimes, the biggest obstacle to access is simply not being able to voice one's own access needs or not being listened to. Keep in mind that nothing is ever perfectly accessible to all people. Constant dialogue and check-ins are necessary for constant readjustment. Open sharing of information is the only way to overcome the barriers of accessibility and the ills of ableism. Thanks for listening, and that's the end of my podcast.